Here is a deceptively simple contracts hypothetical. You can learn a great deal about how to analyze contracts questions by carefully reviewing this fact pattern. Take a look with me at the call of the question. It reads, "What are Joe's rights and remedies? Discuss." Well, we don't have to look at the fact pattern at all to realize that we're dealing with civil litigation. Joe is going to have one or more theories of liability against one or more defendants. And for each one of these theories of liability, he's going to have a prayer for relief. And we know that the laundry list of those prayers includes damages, restitution, and equitable relief. And as it turns out, this fact pattern is testing contracts, and perhaps a little bit it's testing torts, and in great detail it's testing the remedies outline. These short, simple questions can be among the most difficult because since none of the issues presented here really are that difficult, you're being tested on your ability to respond completely under time constraints. Also, as you do multi-state practice, you'll see plenty of multi-state questions on contracts that are longer than this fact pattern. Obviously, they'll have multiple questions following it. So, let's go to the top of the question. In paragraph 1, we meet Joe, our plaintiff, and we meet Steve, our principal defendant. In paragraph 1, we learn about the interactions of these brothers about a parcel of property. Joe wants to occupy a house. Actually, he wants to buy it. His rich brother won't sell it to him, but indicates that if he fixes it up, he can live in it. And then, at the end of paragraph 1, we see an exchange of letters. Joe writes Steve asking to complete the deal. Steve replies indicating basically terms that he can be bound to. If his brother will fix up the property, he can stay there for at least 10 years. Now, at the end of paragraph 1, do we have a contract? I would answer that question in the affirmative. I'd say at this point, there's a deal. However, if there's any ambiguity about whether or not a deal exists, that ambiguity is resolved in paragraph 2, because right after the exchange of letters, our plaintiff begins performance. And this performance is going to be enough to stop his brother from denying the existence of the agreement, and furthermore, to the extent there's any problems with the contract itself, this will serve to take it out of the statute of frauds. Then, in paragraph 3, we learn about the breach, and here we find that Steve has chosen to sell this property to a buyer rather than follow through on his obligation to his brother. And then we get the call of the question. Now, let's pause for a moment. Look carefully at the call of the question. It does not identify a specific defendant. So here, I believe part of what's going on is we are being challenged to think like plaintiff's lawyers. In the absence of direction, we're going to see if we can sue everybody else in the question. Now here, obviously the principal defendant is Steve. He's the guy that the deal was held with by Joe, and he's the guy that has all of the facts surrounding him. But let's not neglect the buyer. There's no specific fact in this pattern that tells us buyer was unaware of the relationship between Joe and Steve. And so, to the extent that the buyer had notice of the underlying agreement between Joe and Steve, he's not a bona fide purchaser. And this is an issue that comes up repeatedly, both on the essays and on every administration of the multi-state. You may see it in slightly different terms than this, but this is a very important issue. So now we pause for a moment and we realize that this comparatively short fact pattern generates a great deal of issues. That's why I think this is such a well-constructed, interesting fact pattern. Again, to the extent any of this stuff is interesting. Still, if I were teaching an introduction to law class to high school students, I'd use a question like this to introduce the material, because nothing in this question is confusing. This is a simple question, but it's a very issue-rich question. So turn the page for a moment and take a look at the way that I organized my response to this answer. This is an analytical framework that will always serve you well. When you get a question that is as vague as this one, just basically giving you some facts and then saying, discuss, you've got to have a clear agenda in your own mind about what you're going to discuss. So now, falling back on the approach that I presented originally, where we consider formation, defenses to formation, performance and breach, defenses to breach, remedies, defenses to remedies. Well, that gives us plenty of room to hang all of these facts. So, as we take a look at the initial issues with regard to formation, a question that arises is when this contract was formed. Was it formed based on the oral discussions between these parties? Answer, almost certainly not. This is a contract for an interest in land, and it ought to be in writing in order to satisfy the statute of frauds. But where we have the exchange of letters, the letter that was signed by the defendant, Steve, is a confirming letter that satisfies the statute of frauds, and it's a writing signed by the party that the plaintiff is seeking to charge with contract liability. And it has the parties, the subject matter, and the terms, including the financial terms. It looks as if this is a valid written document, good enough to satisfy the statute of frauds. So realize that with regard to formation, the defense to formation, the statute of frauds issue, is really built into the formation issue, because we have to make some judgment about the validity of the exchange of letters in order to reach a conclusion at all about formation. So you can't rigidly separate the formation discussion into one that considers the statute of frauds to be only a defense to formation. Here we consider it in order to establish the contract initially. Next, we turn to breach. This is a comparatively simple issue because we've got an example of voluntary disablement. Here we've got a defendant, Steve, bound to a contract with Joe, who deliberately breaches that agreement by selling the underlying subject matter of the agreement, the real property, to buyer. Now, this is not a real property question, even though it involves real property. That's one reason why property issues appear to be spread out across so many different subjects on the exam. This is a contracts question, but it involves real estate, and that fact makes a couple of the issues a little bit more germane, like, for example, the statute of frauds. Also, thinking ahead, we know that contracts for an interest in land go to specific performance. That's the preferred remedy of a plaintiff in just about any deal involving real estate. So, we've established that there's a contract. We've established that the defendant, Steve, has breached that contract through voluntary disablement. So now we go to remedies. And we know that the laundry list are damages, restitution, and specific performance. With regard to damages, if you are really sharp at math, in other words, if you can do basic third-grade arithmetic, you can calculate the damages in this question with a very great degree of precision, because we know how much this house is worth as a rental property. $800 a year times 12 months times 10 years. That's the formula for calculating the damages that this plaintiff has suffered as a result of his inability to occupy this property for 10 years. We also know that he has spent $11,000 out of pocket for various expenses, and we know that the value of his labor is $4,500. So we can discuss all of these money, quote-unquote, damages issues, but we need to be able to make the distinction between the damages and the restitutionary issues. To the extent that this guy has suffered the loss of essentially a free place to live for 10 years, we calculate the value of that tenancy and we give him that dollar value. Those are his damages. But his out-of-pocket costs and the value of his labor really constitute a benefit conferred on the defendant. So we're given all of the math. We can do it or just set up the formulas depending on how confident we are at our math skills under time pressure. But the source of the theory for the remedy is a restitutionary theory. So to take it one step further, consider this. Suppose the value of these services is greater than the cost of the labor and the cost of the various out-of-pocket expenses. To the extent that that benefit conferred is greater, then the plaintiff would be entitled to recover that greater award as a benefit conferred in order to avoid the unjust enrichment of the defendant. Now, maybe that's putting a little bit too sharp a point on the issue with regard to these facts, because we're told in so many words what the value of the labor is. If we analyze one step further, we might consider that the value of the property was enhanced to a greater extent financially than the value of the labor plus the out-of-pocket expenses. Now, we know that the plaintiff here has a preferred remedy that lies in equity. This plaintiff wants specific performance. He wants the court to order this defendant to hand over the keys and let him have the place for 10 years. And I think that our sympathy is with this plaintiff. He didn't do anything wrong. He's been the victim of a willful breach by a spiteful, affluent brother. We want to give him what he wants. So as we consider the elements of specific performance, we know that there is a sufficiently definite and certain contract to justify enforcement. We know that land is unique, so there's no real way to argue that damages are adequate in this case. Land is unique, and so legal remedies simply won't do. Would it be feasible for the court to enforce this agreement? Yes, it would be feasible, but here, mutuality is a little bit of a sticking point. Now, I think mutuality is basically a dead letter, but if we are going to enforce mutuality really at all, that might be a bar to specific performance right there, because the performance by the plaintiff was of a personal services nature, and we're not going to specifically enforce that kind of an agreement. So to the extent mutuality is alive, specific performance might be barred. Now, the way I look at this case, I don't see any reason for mutuality to get in the way of equity, given the fact that we've got a plaintiff here who's got entirely clean hands. Now, the best defense that this defendant has got is his sale of the property. We know that the sale of an item of property, be it a chattel or real property, to a bona fide purchaser for value is enough to cut off the rights of others in equity. So here we have to infer a fact that we don't know actually, which is whether or not this buyer had notice of the relationship between Joe and Steve. If this buyer had notice of the underlying contract, then the buyer is not a bona fide purchaser. The court will set aside that transaction and specifically enforce the contract, thereby giving Joe exactly what he wants and what he deserves, and forcing Steve to fulfill his obligations under the agreement. Now, we don't know what the facts are. I think that probably the majority of people that look at this question just look at the buyer as a buyer who is a bona fide purchaser for value. And if you do that too quickly, then you lose out on the second lawsuit. And notice that I am thinking like a plaintiff's lawyer, even though by nature I'm on the defense. And so I've got the plaintiff suing the buyer also. Now, we don't have many facts to hang that lawsuit on, and we know that the plaintiff doesn't have a contract claim because this guy Joe never had any kind of a deal with the buyer. They are unknown to each other, or at least the buyer is unknown to Joe. If the buyer knew about Joe and deliberately interfered with that agreement by buying the subject matter of the contract between Joe and Steve out from under Joe, well, that's an intentional interference with contract. Arguably, it's also an interference with prospective advantage. And either way, it entitles Joe to remedies against buyer. If he can establish those facts, he's entitled to whatever compensatory damages the situation costs him. But more importantly, it allows him to set aside the underlying breach of the deal with Steve and allow Joe to get specific performance. And finally, the last little thought here is if Joe wins a claim against buyer for interference with contract, that will entitle Joe to punitive damages, because remember that interference with contract or interference with prospective advantage are tort theories of liability. They involve contracts, but they are really tort theories, and a plaintiff who succeeds there is entitled to punitive damages.